Hello everyone, Republic Jim here. I'm just finishing up my overnight camp out on the property and enjoying a couple cups of coffee. You can probably hear the sound of the percolator there on the little stove. It's been a pleasant time, and I wanted to talk about some differences between tents and tarps for doing campouts, and I'm just going to focus on the positive points of each. I'm not going to bother getting into negatives or trying to put down either method. Both of them have their proponents. I'll mention right off the bat that I personally prefer tarps, but just for anybody that hasn't experimented with both of them, just wanted to give kind of an overview. So first of all, go over tents, some of the positive points of them. The obvious one there is privacy. It's much easier with the tent to have a totally enclosed area where you have privacy. That's especially important if you're in a campground or around groups of people. You can do a more enclosed structure with a tarp, but it takes a little more work. When I'm doing a camp out with SAR, then I tend to do it more of an enclosed one instead of an open shelter like what I have now. But for that, tents are just dead simple. You set it up and close the door and you're done with it, and you have your privacy. Another positive there is that they have a floor and you can zip everything up, so it's much easier to keep out any kind of critters. If you're in an area that has snakes or spiders or rodents or what have you, anything that's going to get into your supplies or cause you problems when you're trying to sleep, that can be a big benefit, being able to close them out. And obviously with any kind of tarp structure, there's not really any way to keep out critters. So, for the tent, that's a real positive, especially if you're in an area where that's a problem. I really haven't had any issues here, but I know there's if we had tarantulas around here or something, I'd be much more interested in using a tent. Then another positive is they're very consistent as far as setup. You get familiar with setting up your tent, and it's the same process every time. It could vary slightly depending on whether you're staking it out or have guy lines and such. There could be a little variation depending on the site where you're setting up, but in general, it goes up the same every time. And while you can consistently do the same thing with the tarp, it's a lot different depending on the site that you're at and trees and terrain and everything. So it's not quite as automatic as just setting up a tent, going through the same old steps and everything. So for that, if you want just a consistent setup where you can get the routine down and do it quickly, then a tent is a good option. And then one final point that I wanted to make on that is just the psychological aspect of having walls around you. A lot of people feel more secure just having those walls when they're in the outdoors, even though it's just lightweight nylon and really has no structure to it besides keeping out the elements. It's just, I get it, you know, it gives you more of a sense of security. Even as far as this tarp shelter here, just having this wall behind me, just, you know, subconsciously it just makes me feel a little more secure, even though realistically I know that that wouldn't even slow down something like a bear. And obviously people in tents have been killed by bears and stuff too, and so, you know, it's really not an actual benefit at all, having those walls, is, you know, to keep out any large animals. But as I said, it's just the psychological thing. It just tends to make people feel a little more secure, make them sleep easier. So, you know, for that, for those who are uncomfortable with having the wide open areas around a tarp shelter, you know, a tent is certainly a good option if it helps them to get better sleep just because of that psychological benefit. Then that's a good positive thing for a tent. I'm sure there's others, and you know, people that use a tent all the time could chime in and mention some of the things that they like about it. But I don't actually have that much background with using a tent. I've done it some, but not a lot, other than when I was a kid and we were car camping. But most of my recent experience has been using tarp shelter, so just quickly wanted to go over some of the benefits of that. So first of all, just the opposite of the privacy of the tent is the openness and being able to see around, and it's just a lot more enjoyable to me. Obviously, I wouldn't have a setup like this if I was in a group or in a campground, but when I'm out by myself, there's something really cool about waking up and seeing the sun coming up and all the, you know, the trees, and if there's any deer wandering around, or, you know, it's, you know, you can sort of get that effect in a tent if you open up the windows, but it's just not the same. I can lay in bed and just look around and see all sorts of sights and get that freedom of, it's not quite like just laying out under the stars without a shelter, but it gives you quite a bit of the same feeling with a little protection from the weather just in case. Another benefit is the flexibility, unlike with the tent where you have that process that is just the same every time. You know, yes, it takes more thought figuring out exactly how you want to set it up, but there's a lot more adaptability to this, whatever the setting is. You can, once you're familiar with setting up a tarp shelter in different configurations, you can just look at the trees and the ground and such and figure out what is going to work best for you, and just modify things on the fly. So it's suitable for a lot of different sites that a tent simply wouldn't work. You can just adjust things, especially if you have a cot or you're making a raised platform for your bed or something, and so the ground isn't as big of a concern either. Then you can pretty much set up a tarp shelter anywhere, and it just gives you that extra flexibility that's really nice. And on a similar note, because of the fact that it doesn't have a floor, where I set up here, you know, there's all this vegetation everywhere, and the ground's really uneven, and it just would not work with a tent because you'd have to spend a lot of time clearing away the brush and trying to get the ground to where it wouldn't rip the floor of the tent, and trying to smooth things out. Yeah, don't have to worry about that. Oop, with the tarp. Spilled my coffee. So anyway, as I was saying, again, you have that flexibility with being able to set up in places where the ground just would not be at all suitable for a tent. And even if I was sleeping on the ground instead of on a cot or some sort of raised platform, I could still just clear out a small enough area to put my inflatable sleeping pad and my bag, so I wouldn't need to level a whole section for the footprint of the tent. So yeah, it's just one of those cool things with the tarp where you still want to find a place that's still somewhat convenient, but you can work with just about anything. Another benefit is that depending on the configuration, especially if it's something like this, there's virtually no problem with condensation. Now, when you do more of an enclosed structure with the tarp, then you run into the same condensation issues as you do with the tent. But anytime it's set up to where there's plenty of air movement through, then condensation just isn't a problem, and works really well. And it's nice that I can get up and stand up, and even if I accidentally brush against the tarp, I'm not going to get soaked. So, and that holds true in all sorts of weather conditions too. So yeah, it's and if whether you're doing a lean-to or more of a A-frame or any of those configurations, just so long as it has enough opening for air movement and a decent volume, just not ever really an issue. Then one other benefit of a tarp shelter that a lot of people probably don't think about when they're in a tent is that it gives you the luxury of, during the winter, of having a fire for warmth, and you can set it up in a configuration, especially like this tarp that has the reflective surface on the inside. You can set it up to where the radiant heat from the fire is directed into the shelter. You put the fire outside the shelter and hopefully most of the smoke goes away, but there's enough ventilation that even if you get smoke inside, it clears out, and excuse me, you can get that heat from the fire inside the shelter. Reflects off the back wall or however you have your configuration, and you can stay quite warm as long as the fire is built up. Granted, that takes getting up frequently during the night to stoke up the fire, or make a really good log fire or something that's going to burn for a long time without too much attention. But yeah, you can be fairly comfortable in some really cold, nasty conditions without any really high-end sleeping bags and other gear like that. I know a lot of the people that do winter camping in tents, they tend to have like ultra expensive tents that are double walled and just crazy expensive down sleeping bags and insulated sleeping pads and all this stuff just to try to stay warm, because of course, you know, you can't really have a fire inside the tent, nor can you really get it close enough outside the tent to benefit from that radiant heat nearly as well as you can with the tarp shelter, because a tent just isn't set up for having a fire outside and directing the heat in. But you know, with the tarp, you can do a pretty easy lean-to or something of the sort where you're directing a whole bunch of that heat inside, and so I get by with much lower cost sleeping bag and pad and those things, and I can be comfortable too. You know, granted, I don't get as much sleep because of having to get up and stoke up the fire, but there's no way in the world with my budget that I would be buying the gear to make cold weather tent camping practical. Yeah, so for me, and there's just something really pleasant about laying in the sleeping bag in the shelter and having a crackling fire out front. You can't replicate that if you're all closed in inside a tent. So for that, you know, a tarp shelter is pretty awesome. And then for the extreme cold weather version of that, with the tarp, you can actually set up a super shelter too if you have some clear plastic. Just make a lean-to shelter and then drape the clear plastic over the front of it and build the fire out in front of that, and the radiant heat comes through and reflects off the back of the lean-to, and then it converts to convective heat and is trapped inside the shelter. And it is absolutely amazing how warm you can get the inside of a super shelter as long as the fire is burning well. And you know, you can do that with just really cheap materials, and makes for quite an interesting experience camping out in snow and extreme cold temperature, and doing with just a lightweight emergency tarp and some plastic. And it's just one of those benefits that I don't know, there's no other real way to do that, and so that's just a neat thing that you can do with the tarp shelter. So anyway, as I said, I'm not going to get into the negatives of the different ways. I think either way, as long as it's done right, they work, and it's just up to the preference of the individual. But hopefully that'll be useful to someone who's considering the different options, and yeah, make use of that information, and feel free to share any other points or opinions that you have on the topic. This has been Republic Jim. I'll talk to you later.